What if Moses never wrote the book we built a civilization on? You know the story, or at least you think you do. A man climbs a mountain, God speaks. He descends with commandments, and everything begins. But what if the real story didn't happen in sunlight? What if it was pieced together in exile by men who had lost everything? Babylon, 586 BCE. Jerusalem burns. The temple gone. The people scattered, grieving, asking why their God went silent. And in that silence, something happened. They didn't abandon their faith. They rewrote it, not out of clarity, but desperation. Not on a mountaintop, but in captivity. This isn't the Moses you meet in children's books. This is the other side, where myth becomes memory and scripture becomes survival. Because the Torah wasn't carved in stone, it was written with trembling hands. Jerusalem was supposed to be untouchable, the city of God, the place where heaven and earth shook hands. But in 586 BC, the unthinkable happened. The Babylonian army didn't just invade, they erased. They tore down the walls, set fire to the temple, and marched the people of Judah into exile. To the Israelites, it wasn't just war. It was cosmic betrayal. God was supposed to protect them. The covenant was supposed to hold. But the ark was gone. The altar gone. The priests slaughtered. The monarchy wiped out. Everything that made them chosen disappeared. And maybe worse than the destruction was the silence. No voice from the sky. No prophet with answers. Just foreign soil and unanswered prayers. In Babylon, the Israelites weren't just prisoners. They were theologically homeless, stripped of identity, abandoned by their God. Or so it seemed. And it's here, in this rupture, this deep collapse of certainty, that something strange and unthinkable begins. They don't rebuild the temple. They start writing. Babylon was massive, loud, literate, ancient beyond comprehension, a place where gods had names older than empires, and every myth was written down, neatly, permanently on clay. The Israelites had never seen anything like it. Back home, faith had been blood and fire, sacrifices, altars, seasons, stones. But here, ideas were eternal. You could lose your land, but if you wrote your God into story, you never lost him. So the exiled priests and scribes did something radical. They didn't just mourn. They started recording everything. The creation of the world, the flood, the promise, the law. But they weren't just preserving. They were reframing, wrestling with questions they'd never dared ask before. Why did God let this happen? Had they broken the covenant, or had God? What emerged wasn't just history. It was interpretation. It was theology under pressure, a raw attempt to explain the silence of heaven without letting go of its presence. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. They weren't just stories. They were survival strategies. Scripture is oxygen. And Babylon, it wasn't just their prison. It became their womb. The Torah wasn't born in triumph. It was born in captivity, crafted not by prophets on mountaintops, but by scribes in exile, writing their God back into existence. They weren't kings. They weren't prophets. Most of their names are lost. But in the shadows of Babylon, the scribes took on a burden even Moses never carried. To write God, and not just speak of him. to rebuild a shattered faith, not in stone, but in syntax. They gathered fragments, oral traditions, sacred songs, forgotten laws, and began stitching them into something new. They weren't trying to create a masterpiece. They were trying to remember, to not forget who they were or who he was. That's where the structure of the Torah begins to take shape. The purity laws, the priestly codes, the long, meticulous genealogies. It wasn't obsession. It was grief, disciplined into order. Because if every detail was recorded, maybe God would return. And so, scroll by scroll, line by line, they built something indestructible, a covenant that could survive without a temple, a religion that could live in exile. The temple burned, the king was gone, but the words remained. They didn't just preserve the faith, they rewrote it so it could endure the silence. They needed a voice, someone to carry all of it, the pain, the memory, the law, the longing. And so they reached back to Moses, but not the man who lived and died in the wilderness. That Moses, if he lived, was gone. This Moses was different. He became the thread that held the fragments together, the voice in every law, the witness to every miracle, the bridge between an invisible God and a broken people. The scribes placed him at Sinai, alone with fire. They gave him the law, the blueprint, the burden. He wasn't just a prophet anymore. He became the author, the center of gravity. But here's the truth. The more universal the Torah became, the more mythic Moses had to be. A real man couldn't carry that much. He became less person and more symbol, a sacred fiction that held together a shattered reality. Not because it was false, but because they needed it to be true. The Torah wasn't written in peace. It wasn't written by men with time or certainty. It was written by men trying not to forget, trying not to disappear. Because when everything else is stripped away, land, temple, king, voice, you're left with memory. And memory, when it's threatened, becomes sacred. The Torah is not just law. It's not just myth. It's not even just belief. It's trauma. Organized, pain, shaped into rhythm, loss broken into chapters. It asks impossible questions. Where was God? Why did he abandon us? Did we deserve it? But instead of answering, it keeps telling the story again and again and again. So that silence doesn't win. So that exile doesn't erase. So that a scattered people can still find themselves in words. The Torah isn't a monument. It's a wound that learned how to speak. So, who really wrote the Torah? A prophet with stone tablets, or a line of scribes whispering in exile? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it was never about who held the pen, but why they needed to write it all. When the world collapsed, they didn't scream. They didn't rage. They wrote. And what they wrote endured through empires, through silence, through forgetting. Not because it was perfect, but because it refused to die. If you've ever lost something, if you've ever tried to make sense of the silence, then maybe this story isn't ancient at all. Maybe it's still being written. This is Deep Rewind. If this made you feel something, don't just watch. Stay with us. There's more buried beneath the story.